Reincarnation Imperative, the journey of the Dalai Lamas across time, how they are chosen. A prelude to the Dalai Lama institution. In the high plateaus of Central Asia, where the sky seems to stretch limitlessly over stark mountain ranges, Tibetan Buddhism began to flower as a tradition uniquely adapted to life on the roof of the world. Although Buddhism took root in Tibet between the 7th and 9th centuries, it would only be centuries later that the institution of the Dalai Lama would come to the forefront. The institution's origins lie in the time of Tsongkhapa, 1357–1419, the founder of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, who emphasized rigorous monastic discipline, scholarship, and the importance of philosophical debate. His disciples established a new set of monasteries, such as Ganden, Sera, and Drepung, near Lhasa, sowing the seeds for the eventual emergence of a spiritual leader recognized as a Bodhisattva of Compassion, Avalokiteśvara, in human form. Early in the 15th century, a monk named Gendun Drup, 1391–1474, rose to prominence as a disciple of Tsongkhapa. Though he was not yet called Dalai Lama, Gendun Drup later came to be recognized as the first Dalai Lama in retrospect. It was during this era that a unique understanding of tulku, recognized reincarnations, was taking shape, bridging the deeply held Buddhist belief in rebirth with the idea that especially realized masters, motivated by compassion, would choose to return in human form to benefit all sentient beings. Though dialogue from that time is largely lost, one can imagine an evening in Gendun Drup's final years. Senior disciple, leaning forward, "Master, your teachings have shaped our minds and lives. Yet we cannot help but wonder what will become of us, of your lineage, when you pass beyond this mortal coil." Gendun Drup, smiling, "Worry not about my mortal shell. The Dharma is eternal, and if the merit is sufficient, may Avalokiteśvara guide a swift rebirth to continue the work." Such sentiments, real or apocryphal, capture the essence of the Tibetan concept of reincarnation in service of the Dharma. The first rebirth, Gendun Gyatso. Shortly after the passing of Gendun Drup in 1474, rumors spread that he might be reborn somewhere in central Tibet. His disciples, deeply convinced of his spiritual realization, watched closely for signs. A child speaking unusual words, pointing to religious objects, or displaying an uncanny affinity for aspects of Gendun Drup's previous life. Eventually, a boy named Sangye Fel, born 1475, was identified through an emerging tradition of oracular consultations, divinations, and subtle indications. He was given the name Gendun Gyatso, recognized posthumously as the second Dalai Lama. Gendun Gyatso's recognition marked one of the earliest formal instances of a recognized reincarnation lineage in Tibetan history. During that process, oracles played a supporting role. In Tibetan Buddhism, oracles are mediums, human vessels, through whom protectors or deity figures are believed to speak. The most famous such oracle is the Nechung oracle, consulted by Tibetan authorities to gain insight on spiritual and state matters. Historically, oracles would be invoked during a ceremony involving chanting, ritual drumming, and the wearing of a special costume that signaled the presence of the deity. During the search for Gendun Gyatso, the oracles may have offered cryptic verses, for example. "Look to the place where the waters converge under the shadow of the single cedar. There, a young sprout shall speak with the voice of an elder." Armed with such prophecies, small teams of monks traveled across valleys and mountain passes, seeking such signs. When they discovered a young boy who, upon seeing them, reportedly exclaimed with delight at certain religious objects once belonging to Gendun Drup, they deemed it a powerful clue. Upon verifying this child's identity, older disciples tested him with personal items, rosary beads, ritual implements or prayer books, that had belonged to Gendun Drup. Tradition states that the child consistently chose correctly among identical-looking items. Although historical records are incomplete, the essence of these stories reflects the careful testing and repeated confirmations that became standard practice in identifying a reincarnation. The term Dalai Lama emerges. Although the third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, 1543–1588, was the first officially to bear the title Dalai Lama, conferred by the Mongolian ruler Altan Khan. That title was retroactively applied to Gendun Drup and Gendun Gyatso, recognizing them as the first and second Dalai Lamas. The phrase Dalai Lama is a combination of the Mongolian word for ocean, Dalai, and the Tibetan word for master or teacher, Lama, implying ocean of wisdom. Sonam Gyatso fostered close ties with Mongol chiefs, significantly influencing Tibetan politics. Later, Tibetan tradition came to see the Dalai Lamas as both spiritual leaders and, eventually, temporal leaders of Tibet, further entrenching the custom of discovering each new Dalai Lama as a reincarnation of his predecessor. A glimpse at karma and reincarnation. From a theological standpoint, the recognition of a child as a Dalai Lama depends on Buddhist concepts of karma and rebirth. In Mahayana Buddhism, Bodhisattvas delay their own final enlightenment out of compassion, so they can return lifetime after lifetime to help others. The Dalai Lamas are believed to be emanations of Avalokiteśvara, the Bodhisattva of Compassion, who has vowed not to attain full Buddhahood until all beings are liberated from suffering. Karmic connection is crucial. The collective faith and merit of the community, plus the accumulated virtue of the prior Dalai Lama, guide the rebirth to a new child. Because that child is believed to embody the awakened compassion of Avalokiteśvara, the search for him is approached with solemn devotion, and sometimes political maneuvering. The foundations of a tradition. Between the lifetimes of Gendun Drup and Sonam Gyatso, the process of recognizing Tulkus, reincarnate lamas, started becoming standard within the Gelug school, and soon spread to other Tibetan Buddhist schools, Kagyu, Nyingma, Sakya as well. However, the Dalai Lama lineage grew to be the most prominent and politically central in Tibet. In the centuries ahead, the institution of the Dalai Lama would face challenges both internal, struggles among Tibetan schools and aristocratic families, and external Mongol Chinese, and later Western intrusions. But in that early moment, the seeds were planted for a lineage that would shape the religious and cultural identity of Tibet for centuries. Part 2. The Great Fifth and the Rise of Political Power. A new era dawns. By the early 17th century, the Dalai Lama lineage had gained enough momentum that each new discovery reverberated across Tibetan territory. The fourth Dalai Lama, Yonten Gyatso, 1589–1617, uniquely came from a Mongolian royal lineage, reflecting the strong Mongol-Tibetan ties that had begun under Sonam Gyatso. While the fourth Dalai Lama's tenure was brief and complicated by regional power struggles, it set the stage for the ascension of one of the most influential figures in Tibetan history, Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso, the fifth Dalai Lama, 1617–1682. The fifth Dalai Lama's ascent. Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso is often referred to as the Great Fifth. In Tibetan history, he stands out for consolidating political and spiritual authority in the office of the Dalai Lama. He forged alliances with Gushri Khan, a powerful Mongol leader who helped defeat rival factions, thus enabling the fifth Dalai Lama to become the de facto ruler of Tibet. Contemporaries marveled at how a child, recognized as the rebirth of Yonten Gyatso, came to hold such authority. The story of the Great Fifth's discovery contains the hallmark elements: oracles, regents, and a rigorous testing of the child's memory. According to some accounts, a group of high lamas consulted the Nechong oracle and also performed Mo, dice divination, to confirm the location of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. They eventually found a child who reportedly exclaimed upon seeing them, "Young Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso," wide-eyed, "I was waiting for you. Do you still have my mala?" Senior monk, bowing reverently, "This child speaks with the old voice. Could it be true that he remembers the prayer beads we carry?" They tested him with personal items, and the child showed an extraordinary affinity, prompting the regent to declare him the legitimate reincarnation. Building the Potala Palace. One of the Great Fifth's most enduring legacies is the Potala Palace in Lhasa. Perched atop Marpuri, the Red Hill, the Potala stands as a symbol of Tibet's spiritual and political might, its white and red fortress-like walls dominating the city. Construction began under his rule in 1645, and continued after his death, financed by both Mongol and Tibetan patrons. The palace became the official seat of the Dalai Lamas, emblematic of their dual roles as religious and temporal leaders. The Great Fifth's personal involvement in the design and purpose of the Potala is well documented. It was envisioned as a place to house relics and serve as a grand monastic and administrative complex. The combination of monastic discipline and political governance within one towering structure reflected the unique Ganden Phodrang government that the fifth Dalai Lama established. Controversies and politics. While revered as a wise and learned master, the fifth Dalai Lama's rule also carried controversies. Rivals, especially from the Kagyu and Bon traditions, accused him of consolidating power at their expense. Court intrigues flared. The regents and ministers surrounding the Dalai Lama sometimes pursued their own agendas, leveraging the regency periods, when a Dalai Lama was still a child, to exert influence over Tibet's governance. For devout Buddhists, however, the Great Fifth's achievements were seen as fulfillments of karmic destiny, with the Dalai Lama serving as the living embodiment of compassion guiding Tibet through uncertain times. For the political elites, his leadership represented an opportunity to centralize power and unify the Tibetan plateau under one banner, forging a sense of national identity. Spiritual dimensions. In theological circles, the fifth Dalai Lama's era coincided with a flowering of Gelug scholarship and an increased emphasis on esoteric tantric practices. As a manifestation of Avalokiteśvara, the Dalai Lama was regarded as holding a special power to transmit blessings through the highest yoga tantras. Oracles, too, were increasingly consulted at the behest of the Dalai Lama's government. The Nechung oracle became an indispensable advisor, consulted for major state decisions, including potential alliances or military actions. When the oracle entered trance, high officials would kneel and place their questions on scrolls, waiting for the possessed medium to scribble or speak cryptic messages. The legacy of the Great Fifth. When Nyawang Lobsang Gyatso passed away in 1682, his close minister Sangye Gyatso concealed his death for 15 years to complete the Potala Palace and maintain political stability. This act of deception was itself a major controversy, fueling later tensions when the regency was forced to explain why the Dalai Lama's purported retreat had lasted so long. However, the power and prestige of the Dalai Lama institution was firmly established. From that point on, each subsequent reincarnation would be recognized not only as a religious master, but as the legitimate ruler of Tibet, though they would also grapple with the immense burdens of politics, especially during their childhood regency periods. Part 3. Childhood and Regency. The sixth Dalai Lama, a poet in conflict. The sixth Dalai Lama, Tsangnyang Gyatso, 1683–1706, was recognized as the reincarnation of the Great Fifth under unusual and fraught circumstances. Known for his romantic poetry and charismatic presence, Tsangnyang Gyatso grew into a figure beloved by ordinary Tibetans, but criticized by more conservative elements in the monastic establishment. Legends describe the process of finding him. A peasant boy from Arunachal Pradesh, in modern-day India, who displayed innate spiritual qualities. Yet he eschewed the strict monastic code, famously enjoying strolls in Lhasa at night, sipping chang, Tibetan barley beer, and writing longing verses. I prostrate not often but to love, fleeting like a dream on a moonlit path. For the devout, this behavior seemed contradictory for a Dalai Lama. Political struggles also arose because of the long concealment of the fifth Dalai Lama's death, leaving a chaotic scene in which Mongol forces and local Tibetan rulers vied for control. Eventually, Tsangnyang Gyatso was deposed and disappeared under mysterious circumstances while being taken to Beijing by Mongol escorts. To this day, legends claim that he either died in captivity or lived incognito, writing further poems. Regents and power struggles. The controversies surrounding the sixth Dalai Lama underscore a central theme. During a Dalai Lama's childhood, a regent or group of regents typically holds power. These regents come from high-ranking lamas or aristocratic families, often giving them significant political clout. Naturally, vested interests in controlling the regency have led to fierce rivalries, occasional bribery, and sometimes even violence. Each time a Dalai Lama dies, a fresh set of intrigues arises over who will become regent, how the search party will be funded, and which oracles, divinations, or influential parties will guide the process. This interplay between faith in the reincarnation and political aspiration became a hallmark of Tibetan governance over the centuries. The 7th through 9th Dalai Lamas. After Dzangyang Gyatso's contested disappearance, several recognized incarnations followed in fairly rapid succession. The 7th Dalai Lama, Khalzang Gyatso, 1708-1757, sought to restore the spiritual dignity of the office after the turbulence of his predecessor's tenure. He also codified some of the processes related to the selection of reincarnations and dealt with ongoing Mongol and Qing dynasty, Chinese influence. The 8th Dalai Lama, Jamphel Gyatso, 1758-1804, and the 9th Dalai Lama, Longtok Gyatso, 1806-1815, both ascended amid increasing involvement from the Qing court, which introduced the controversial practice of using the golden urn for selecting high lamas. The golden urn was a ritual container used to draw lots for identifying genuine reincarnations of high-ranking lamas, a method meant to reduce fraud or favoritism. This process stood in tension with traditional Tibetan methods of oracular and investigative selection. Though some Tibetans saw the golden urn as a foreign imposition, others recognized it as a pragmatic step to mitigate conflict. Nonetheless, the tension between Tibetan autonomy and Qing oversight remained palpable. Life in the monasteries. Amid these political undercurrents, monastic life for a child recognized as the Dalai Lama was a mixture of religious education, ritual responsibilities, and regal ceremony. Typically, the child would be enthroned at a major monastery, Drepung, Sira, or in later times the Potala Palace itself, amid elaborate rites. Surrounded by tutors, prayer sessions, and a strict schedule, the young Dalai Lama would be expected to master classical Tibetan, Buddhist philosophy, debate, and meditation. Imagine a scene in the courtyard of Drepung Monastery. Tutor, sternly, Your Holiness, remember that each debate is not just an intellectual exercise, but also a way to sharpen the mind to better serve sentient beings. Young Dalai Lama, clutching prayer beads, eyes wide. Yes, teacher, I understand. But my arms tire from the clapping, and my voice grows hoarse from recitation. Tutor, softening. Compassion must be paired with wisdom. We train our bodies and voices to ensure the purity of the Dharma is upheld. Soon you will lead all of Tibet. We must prepare you for the weight of that responsibility. Such daily life anecdotes offer a glimpse of the blend of austere scholarship and looming governance that Dalai Lamas experienced from a tender age. The role of oracles and portents. Oracles continued to be a pivotal part of each discovery. Additionally, portents, unusual rainbows, auspicious dreams, or signs in nature, were believed to accompany the birth of a Dalai Lama. For instance, it was said that around the birth of the 8th Dalai Lama, rainbows appeared over the boy's village, or that certain animals behaved unusually as an omen of his significance. Before finalizing a candidate, regents and high lamas would often cast mo dice, consult the nechung or other state oracles, and send out secret watchers to observe how the child behaved. Did he recite mantras spontaneously, show familiarity with the previous Dalai Lama's possessions, or demonstrate knowledge no ordinary child would have? Qing influence and the golden urn. By the 18th century, the Qing dynasty exercised suzerainty over Tibet. The Qianlong emperor introduced regulations, including the use of the golden urn, to reduce what he perceived as corruption or manipulation in the recognition of high lamas. In theory, the names of possible reincarnations would be placed in the urn, and a lot would be drawn before the statue of the Buddha or Jowo Rinpoche in Lhasa, seeking a divine hand in selection. Tibetans, however, often continued their traditional methods discreetly, using the golden urn only as a formality, or sometimes not at all. This dual system sowed seeds of controversy that persist even into modern times. Did the Chinese state have the right to enforce the selection of Tibetan religious leaders? For many devout Buddhists, The ultimate question was whether the child being chosen truly carried the spiritual mantle of the previous Dalai Lama. The tension between tradition and political oversight made these recognition processes even more complicated than they already were on purely spiritual grounds. Part 4. The 19th century to the 13th Dalai Lama. A fragile time. The 19th century was marked by frequent successions. Several Dalai Lamas passed away at young ages, often before they reached their majority. This meant that real power lay in the hands of regents and influential ministers, who navigated a labyrinth of internal Tibetan politics and external pressures from the Qing dynasty. The 10th Dalai Lama, Tsultrim Gyatso, 1816–1837, and the 11th Dalai Lama, Kedrup Gyatso, 1838–1856, died young. Both had relatively short reigns overshadowed by regental governance. The 12th Dalai Lama, Trinley Gyatso, 1856–1875, also died before fully assuming power. Whether these early deaths were due to illness, the harsh environment, or foul play, there is much speculation in Tibetan history. Regardless, the repeated child enthronements meant that the institution of the Dalai Lama, while revered, often lacked a stable adult leader at its head. Growing tensions. During these frequent successions, Tibetan officials were embroiled in power struggles. This instability provided opportunities for outside forces, particularly the British Empire in India and Tsarist Russia, to attempt to influence Tibetan affairs. The Qing dynasty's grip was also weakening, setting the stage for a new chapter in Tibetan history with the ascent of the 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso, 1876–1933, a figure who would guide Tibet through the tumult of the early 20th century. The 13th Dalai Lama's discovery. When the 12th Dalai Lama died in 1875, the now well-established system for searching out his reincarnation swung into action again. The regent and senior lamas observed portents and received oracular advice. The Nechung oracle in trance might have pronounced, "Seek the shining star at the confluence of the turquoise waters. He who sits amid the juniper at dawn shall recognize his own face in the sacred mirror." Interpreting this cryptic message, search parties fanned out across central Tibet. Eventually they located a child whose father was a modest farmer near Lhasa. Traditional accounts report that the toddler was calm and solemn, showing an intuitive recognition of religious objects. After various tests, he was enthroned as the 13th Dalai Lama, Thubten Gyatso. Reform and modernization. The 13th Dalai Lama came of age as a period of global upheaval dawned. Empires were collapsing, new states were emerging, and technological wonders were transforming societies. Tibet faced British incursions from India, culminating in the British expedition to Tibet in 1903–1904, led by Colonel Younghusband. Meanwhile, the Qing dynasty tried to reassert control. Thubten Gyatso responded by undertaking modernizing reforms. He sought to create a Tibetan army, introduce a postal system, and even sent young Tibetans abroad to learn modern skills. He also reaffirmed Tibetan independence from a weakening China, although this remained a fragile claim internationally. Despite these efforts, internal resistance to change was stiff, especially among conservative monastic establishments who feared that modernization would erode Tibetan traditions. Even so, the 13th Dalai Lama's leadership style, firm yet open-minded, cemented his reputation as a visionary attempting to steer Tibet into the modern world while preserving its spiritual core. Spiritual authority and public life. Throughout this period, the Dalai Lama's spiritual authority remained paramount, even if many monastic officials resisted his secular reforms. For the Tibetan populace, the Dalai Lama was still Avalokiteśvara in human form, a figure to revere, protect, and obey. Public audiences with the 13th Dalai Lama were rare and deeply moving events, as recounted by pilgrims who described a palpable aura of compassion emanating from him. One such pilgrim might have reported, "Pilgrim, after prostrating, I felt as if the entire weight of my sorrows lifted when I beheld his gaze. In his presence, I sensed an overwhelming compassion, like a warm sun cutting through the cold mountain wind. Such testimonies reinforced the notion that the Dalai Lama, even when embroiled in political matters, remained at heart a spiritual guide. Clash with external powers. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, Tibet found itself in precarious positions internationally. China, though fractured by revolution, still claimed Tibet as part of its territory. Britain sought to preserve its own strategic interests. The 13th Dalai Lama navigated these tensions with diplomatic caution, reaffirming Tibetan claims to de facto independence. He also recognized that the day might come when Tibet needed stronger defenses, leading him to continue his short-lived military and administrative reforms. However, powerful monastic lobbies feared that a strong central government and armed forces would overshadow the authority of the great monasteries. The spectre of internal dissent was never far away. Despite these challenges, the 13th Dalai Lama's reign lasted until his death in 1933, leaving Tibet with a stronger sense of national identity but few lasting modern institutions. Part 5. The 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. Searching in a troubled time. With the 13th Dalai Lama's death in 1933, Tibet once again faced the monumental task of identifying a reincarnation. But this time, the political climate was far more volatile. China was in the midst of internal conflict, and World War II loomed on the global horizon. As the regent and senior lamas prepared to search for the next Dalai Lama, they could not ignore the shifting geopolitical winds. The regent, Reting Rinpoche, oversaw the search. According to traditional accounts, he had visions at the sacred lake of Lamolatso, a lake in central Tibet believed to grant prophetic reflections. In its waters, some said he saw the letters A, Ka, and Ma, while others claimed he saw the image of a three-storied monastery with a jade-green roof and a road curving beside it. Emboldened by these signs, search parties traveled to the Amdo region, now in Qinghai province in China. There, they found a young boy named Lhamo Dondup, who displayed extraordinary familiarity with the possessions of the 13th Dalai Lama's household. Specifically, the story goes that when presented with two similar rosaries, the boy selected the one that had belonged to the 13th Dalai Lama, exclaiming, "That's mine." Enthronement and early years. The child was recognized as the 14th Dalai Lama, taking the name Tenzin Gyatso. He was brought to Lhasa and enthroned in 1940 within the grand halls of the Potala Palace. At the time, Tenzin Gyatso was just a toddler, and the responsibilities of state fell to regents and ministers until he came of age. During those early years, Tenzin Gyatso underwent rigorous monastic training in philosophy, dialectics, and spiritual practice. Like his predecessors, he studied under esteemed tutors, learning the intricacies of Buddhist texts, memorizing lengthy scriptures, and honing his debate skills in the courtyards of the great monasteries. Yet this was a different era. Radio broadcasts crackled with news of world events, and rumors of conflict beyond the Himalayas reached even the secluded halls of Lhasa's monasteries. The young Dalai Lama absorbed these changes with curiosity and concern. Chinese incursion and the 1950s crisis. In 1950, when Tenzin Gyatso was just 15, the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong declared its intention to liberate Tibet. The Chinese People's Liberation Army soon crossed into Tibetan territory, overwhelming Tibetan resistance. Under immense pressure, the young Dalai Lama was formally enthroned at the age of 15, taking on full political power far earlier than planned. Dialogue in Lhasa at that time might have captured the enormity of his burden. Regent, bowing. "Your Holiness, the Chinese armies are at our gates. We have no choice but to accelerate your enthronement." Tenzin Gyatso, wide-eyed, voice trembling. "But I'm only a boy. How can I bear the burden of my people's suffering alone?" Regent, solemnly. "You are the Dalai Lama, the manifestation of Avalokiteśvara. The people look to you for guidance and hope." Despite his youth, Tenzin Gyatso tried to negotiate with Beijing, eventually signing the 17-point agreement under duress in 1951, a treaty that recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet while promising to preserve Tibet's political system and religion. In practice, tensions continued to mount. Flight into exile. By 1959, years of unrest culminated in a major uprising in Lhasa. Fearing for his life and the safety of his people, the Dalai Lama fled across the Himalayas into exile in India, where he was granted asylum by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Along with thousands of Tibetans, Tenzin Gyatso established the Tibetan government in exile in Dharamshala, in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. This marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Dalai Lama institution. No longer a ruler in his own land, Tenzin Gyatso transformed into a global figure, championing Tibetan culture, Buddhism, and nonviolent approaches to conflict resolution. Spiritual leadership in exile. Though stripped of political control over Tibet, the Dalai Lama's spiritual leadership only grew. In exile, Tibetan Buddhism spread throughout the world, partly due to the diaspora of monastics who established monasteries in India, Nepal, and eventually in Western countries. Tenzin Gyatso engaged in interfaith dialogues, traveling extensively to promote peace and universal responsibility. Despite the painful circumstances, he encouraged modern education for Tibetan children in exile, ensuring that the younger generation would be literate not only in Tibetan language and Buddhist tradition, but also in global subjects like science, mathematics, and history. He also continued to act according to the role of a bodhisattva, offering teachings on compassion, emptiness, and altruism. In 1989, his efforts toward peace and nonviolence were recognized with the Nobel Peace Prize. He became a moral voice on the global stage, often referred to by supporters as the living Buddha of compassion. Chinese view and ongoing controversies. Inside Tibet, the Chinese government sought to control the narrative around the Dalai Lama. Officially, Beijing denounced him as a separatist, and attempts were made to suppress images of him. Meanwhile, Beijing also insisted that any future Dalai Lama would have to be recognized through the state-sanctioned process, claiming that the authority to approve high reincarnations lies with the Chinese government, partly referencing the historical use of the golden urn from the Qing era. This controversy remains unresolved. The Dalai Lama has publicly speculated on whether he might choose not to reincarnate or be reborn outside of Chinese-controlled territory, to prevent Beijing from installing a fake Dalai Lama. The question of the 15th Dalai Lama has thus become a geopolitical issue as much as a spiritual one. The Panchen Lama dispute. Another major controversy tied to the Dalai Lama institution is the recognition of the Panchen Lama, historically the second most important figure in the Gelug tradition and a key participant in recognizing Dalai Lamas. In 1995, Tenzin Gyatso recognized a 6-year-old boy, Gedhun Choki Nyima, as the 11th Panchen Lama. Within days, the child and his family disappeared, with Chinese authorities announcing an alternative candidate, Gyalnkay Norbu, as the official Panchen Lama. For many Tibetans, the abduction of the recognized Panchen Lama epitomizes China's strategy to control the reincarnation process, and by extension, the future recognition of the Dalai Lama. Part 6. Theological Underpinnings and Modern Debates. Revisiting Karma and Compassion. Throughout the centuries, the theological basis for discovering and installing each Dalai Lama has stayed grounded in Mahayana Buddhist concepts of bodhisattvas and reincarnation. The Dalai Lama is seen as an emanation of Avalokiteśvara, the bodhisattva who made an unshakable vow to save all beings from suffering. The continuity of this vow, expressed from life to life, underscores why a small child could hold such authority. It is the continuation of a pure intention and deep spiritual realization, not merely an accident of birth. Karmically, it is believed that the collective virtue of the Tibetan people and the unwavering compassion of Avalokiteśvara caused this rebirth to manifest among them in a visible way. Each successive Dalai Lama is thus a bridge between the spiritual realm of enlightened beings and the temporal world of politics and daily life. The role of oracles and divination. Today, in the modern era, oracles such as the Nechong oracle continue to be consulted by the Dalai Lama and other high lamas on significant spiritual and administrative matters. While the Dalai Lama has embraced scientific inquiry and expressed a willingness to reshape Tibetan traditions in certain ways, he still upholds the continuity of ancient oracular practice, seeing it as part of Tibet's rich spiritual heritage. However, younger Tibetans in exile sometimes question the reliance on oracles, given today's emphasis on rational education and global perspectives. The Dalai Lama has often encouraged open-mindedness and reasoned debate, reflecting the Gelug tradition's philosophical rigor. Controversies over succession. As Tenzin Gyatso ages, the question of his successor looms large. He has made various statements, including the possibility of reincarnating outside Tibet, or even not reincarnating at all, arguing that the institution of the Dalai Lama might have served its purpose. This has raised intense debate among Tibetans. Traditionalists argue that the lineage must continue for the sake of Tibet's spiritual well-being. Progressives wonder if clinging to the institution is practical, or if new forms of leadership could better serve modern Tibetan interests. Chinese authorities maintain that only they can approve the next Dalai Lama, citing historical precedents and the claim that Tibet is part of China. This clash between religious tradition, geopolitical interests, and modernist thinking places the future of the Dalai Lama's institution on uncertain ground. The Dalai Lama's own perspective. Tenzin Gyatso has expressed that the main purpose of the Dalai Lama reincarnation is to serve the Dharma and all sentient beings. If the title becomes a mere political football, he argues, it might be better to let it end with him. Yet, he also recognizes that millions of Tibetans look to the Dalai Lama for comfort and guidance, especially given their cultural and religious identity is under pressure. In interviews and public speeches, he offers humorous or candid responses to these weighty questions. Dalai Lama, smiling. If I come back, maybe I'll be a pretty girl next time. The important point is the benefit to others, not the form it takes. Dalai Lama, more seriously. The matter of my reincarnation will be decided by the Tibetan people, not by political entities. If I am reborn, I will leave clear instructions. If the majority of Tibetan people wish to preserve this institution, it will be so. Western fascination. Meanwhile, Western fascination with the Dalai Lama continues, often focusing on his charisma, philosophy of kindness, and message of religious harmony. Many non-Tibetans see him as a figure embodying global humanitarian values rather than just a Tibetan Buddhist leader. This celebrity status has contributed to the spread of Tibetan Buddhism worldwide, with new centers and monasteries established in Europe, the Americas, and Australia. Part 7. Epilogue, Past, Present, and Future. The lineage in retrospect. Looking back across 6 centuries of Dalai Lamas, one sees a complex tapestry woven of spiritual devotion, political intrigue, cultural resilience, and unwavering compassion. From Gendun Drup, who quietly cultivated the Gelug tradition in the wake of Tsongkhapa, to Tenzin Gyatso, who tours the globe spreading a message of universal responsibility, each Dalai Lama has left a unique imprint on Tibetan history. The Great Fifth built the Potala Palace and unified Tibet under a theocratic system. The Sixth was a romantic who composed poetry and lived a rebellious life. Several young Dalai Lamas died before taking the reins, leaving Tibet in flux. The 13th tried to modernize Tibet in the face of imperial pressure. The 14th, exiled from his homeland, became a global symbol of nonviolence and cultural preservation. Each life story merges the mystical with the mundane, reflecting Tibet's enduring belief that profound spiritual realization can and should guide societal governance. The heart of Tibetan Buddhism. At the heart of the Dalai Lama institution is the deeply held conviction that wisdom and compassion are not abstract ideals, but living qualities embodied by certain exceptional beings. This belief in the Tulku system extends beyond the Dalai Lama lineage, permeating Tibetan culture through thousands of recognized reincarnate lamas across various schools. The Dalai Lamas stand at the apex of this system, symbolizing the living union of Avalokiteśvara and the Tibetan people. Each enthronement ceremony, each counsel from the Nechung oracle, each subtle sign of a child's past life memories, these traditions carry forward a profound sense of continuity, in a region buffeted by historical storms. Present-day controversies. In the 21st century, controversies swirl around the Dalai Lama institution, political legitimacy. China claims the right to name the next Dalai Lama, framing it as a continuation of Qing-era practices. Tibetans in exile and many within Tibet reject this notion, insisting the lineage is a spiritual matter decided by Tibetan religious authorities. Panchen Lama dispute, the disappearance of the boy recognized by Tenzin Gyatso versus the state-appointed alternative, has become a human rights and religious freedom concern, implicating international bodies in ongoing debates. Relevance of the institution. Some in the Tibetan community question whether a theocratic figurehead is appropriate in a modern democratic context. Others respond that the Dalai Lama has already transitioned to a more constitutional and spiritual role rather than ruling as an absolute authority. Global influence. The Dalai Lama's popularity in the West sparks occasional backlash from Chinese officials who view his engagements with world leaders as attempts to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Community and cultural preservation. Despite these tensions, the Tibetan community, both inside Tibet and in the diaspora, remains deeply devoted to the Dalai Lama. Monasteries in India, Nepal, and other countries have worked diligently to preserve Tibetan language, scriptures, rituals, and arts. Cultural festivals, language classes, and Buddhist teachings are offered in exile schools, bridging the gap between ancient tradition and modern life. Inside Tibet, many still cling to the image of the Dalai Lama as a beacon of hope, displaying hidden photographs in private shrines. Though restrictions are tight, countless devotees secretly recite prayers for his long life. The reverence for the Dalai Lama is woven into the fabric of Tibetan identity, a silent but potent symbol of resistance to cultural assimilation. The Dalai Lama's vision. Tenzin Gyatso often speaks of a middle-way approach toward China, seeking genuine autonomy for Tibet while acknowledging the People's Republic of China's role. In parallel, he frequently emphasizes compassion in daily life, encouraging people of all faiths and no faith to cultivate kindness, ethical discipline, and altruism. He also places great importance on educational reform, encouraging Tibetan monastics to study science and urging Buddhist practitioners to engage in dialogue with psychologists, physicists, and neuroscientists. He believes that the principles of compassion can be understood in a secular context, which broadens their reach across cultural boundaries. The next reincarnation, or the last. One of the biggest open questions is, will there be a 15th Dalai Lama? The 14th Dalai Lama has explicitly stated that if he chooses to reincarnate, he will leave instructions on how to recognize him, likely outside of China's jurisdiction. In the event that Chinese authorities appoint a Dalai Lama inside Tibet, it may create two claimants, one recognized by exiled Tibetan Buddhists and one backed by Beijing. Such a split would undoubtedly trigger a crisis of legitimacy reminiscent of historical schisms in other religious traditions. Alternatively, the Dalai Lama may decide the institution has run its course, encouraging Tibetans to look to democratic structures and a variety of qualified lamas for spiritual leadership. If that scenario unfolds, the centuries-long practice of enthroning a single supreme spiritual leader might fade into history, replaced by a more decentralized approach. A living legacy. Regardless of these uncertainties, the legacy of the Dalai Lamas remains immense. From the 15th century life of Gendun Drup to the 21st century global stature of Tenzin Gyatso, the Dalai Lama institution has shaped Tibetan Buddhism and captured the world's imagination. Their stories interweave devotion and doubt, miracles and diplomacy, tragedy and joy, reflecting the full spectrum of human experience through the lens of enlightened compassion. In closing, consider a young Tibetan child walking up the steps of the Potala Palace in Lhasa, hearing whispered legends of the Great Fifth building these halls, of the romantic verses of the Sixth, and of the 14th, who lives in distant exile. That child knows the Dalai Lama is more than a legend. He is a living continuity that connects the Tibetan present to a spiritual vision transcending time. Whether or not the lineage continues beyond Tenzin Gyatso, its profound message of compassion, rooted in the Buddhist conviction that each of us holds a spark of the infinite, remains a beacon of hope for Tibet and for the world.